The mountains were old before anything else on this continent had yet learned how to be old, their ridgelines worn soft and rounded by the patient, unhurried hand of more than 400 million years of rain and frost, and the slow, imperceptible breathing of tectonic plates shifting in their sleep far below the surface. And if you were to stand on one of those high balds just before sunrise, before the light had found its courage, you would see the way the ranges folded into one another like the pages of a great book left open on the lap of some dreaming giant. Each valley a crease, each hollow a sentence written in a language that predates the very idea of language. And you would feel something settle in your chest that was not fear but recognition. As though your body remembered a time when these mountains were taller than the Himalayas, when they scraped the edge of a sky that had not yet decided what color it wanted to be. The mist that gathers in those folds each evening does not behave like ordinary mist, the old-timers will tell you, speaking slowly from the porches of houses that have stood in these valleys for 5 and 6 and 7 generations. It moves with something that resembles intention, pooling first in the lowest draws and creek bottoms before rising, layer by patient layer, until the hollows are filled with a silver-white stillness so complete that standing inside it feels less like being surrounded by weather, and more like being held inside a thought that the mountain is slowly, carefully thinking. And the sounds change too, they will say, their voices dropping to match the hush of the memory itself. The way a whippoorwill calling from one ridge will seem to arrive from the opposite direction, the way a creek that has always run south will suddenly sound as though it is running north, the way silence in these deep places is not the absence of sound, but something far more deliberate and far more ancient, a silence that has weight and texture and temperature, a silence that has been accumulating in these hollows since long before the first human footstep ever pressed into the dark, loamy soil, since long before anything walked upright beneath these canopies that close overhead like the slow clasping of enormous, gentle hands. There is a woman named Delia who has lived her entire life in a small town pressed into the crease where 2 ridges meet. A town so small that the post office and the general store share the same building and the same front porch, and she has served on the county search and rescue team for 31 years, beginning when she was barely 19, and her grandmother told her that knowing the mountains was a responsibility, not a skill, and that the land would teach her everything she needed if she would only agree to listen with something deeper than her ears. She sits in a chair on that porch now, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that holds the warmth of chicory coffee, the way a stone holds the warmth of a long afternoon sun, and the light from a single lamp behind her catches the silver at her temples, while the rest of her face remains soft in shadow, and she speaks the way the creek below the town speaks, steady, unhurried, finding its way around obstacles rather than through them, each word placed with the kind of care that comes from decades of walking terrain where a misstep could send you sliding down a hillside carpeted in wet leaves into a ravine that might not appear on any map. The mountain doesn't mean you harm, she says, and the way she says it makes it clear that this is not reassurance but simple fact, the way one might observe that water flows downhill or that the dogwoods bloom before the oaks. But there are places in there, certain hollows, certain draws, where the mountain is doing something that isn't for us, something that was happening long before we arrived and will be happening long after we're gone, and the kindest thing you can do, the most respectful thing, is to let it be. Beyond the porch, beyond the road, beyond the thin line of sycamores that mark the creek's passage through the center of town, the mountains rise into a darkness so complete and so benevolent that it seems less like the absence of light and more like the presence of rest itself, an entire landscape settling into the deepest, most ancient sleep imaginable. The documentary that unfolds is not concerned with answers, and this is perhaps the first thing you notice as you settle into its rhythm, the way a stone settles into the bed of a creek. It is concerned instead with atmosphere, with the quality of light as it filters through hemlock and rhododendron into those deep Appalachian hollows where the air is 10 degrees cooler and carries the sweet, complex scent of decomposing leaves and wet stone, and the faint mineral tang of water that has been filtering through limestone for centuries before it emerges, clear and impossibly cold, from a crack in a mossy boulder that has not moved since before the idea of movement existed. The camera lingers on surfaces, the grain of a hand-hewn porch railing worn smooth by generations of palms, the way firelight moves across the face of an old topographic map tacked to a wall, the slow drip of condensation from the lip of a tin roof into a barrel that has been catching rain since someone's great-grandmother placed it there. And each image dissolves into the next with the same patient inevitability that governs the turning of seasons in these mountains, where spring does not arrive so much as it seeps upward from the roots, where autumn does not fall so much as it exhales, releasing its color the way a sleeper releases the tension in their shoulders as they finally, gratefully, let go. And beneath these images, beneath the quiet voices and the ambient sounds of wind through sourwood branches, and the distant, rhythmic conversation of a creek with its own stones, there runs something that you feel more than hear, a low and resonant hum that might be the sound the mountains themselves make when they believe no one is listening, a frequency that vibrates at the exact threshold between sound and silence, between waking and the warm, heavy threshold of sleep. A man named Harlan, whose surname stretches back through these hollows for so many generations that the family has become indistinguishable from the geography itself. A ridge bears their name. Why, a creek bears their name. A particular stand of old-growth tulip poplar bears their name, though no sign marks it and no map records it, sits in a straight-back chair beside a wood stove whose iron flanks glow with the deep, ruddy warmth of cherry coals, and his hands, broad and steady, rest on his knees with the particular stillness of a man who has learned that the most important things reveal themselves only to those who can be still long enough to receive them. He has led search and rescue operations in these mountains for more than 40 years, beginning when he was a boy following his father up trails that were not trails, but rather the memory of trails, paths worn into the mountain by decades of footsteps that the forest was always, patiently, working to reclaim with fern and moss and the slow or persistent creep of rhododendron roots across the forest floor. There's a hollow about 8 miles in from the Nolan Ridge trailhead, he says, and his voice has the quality of wood smoke, warm, slightly rough, carrying with it the faint ghost of something that burned a long time ago. And we've got it marked on our maps with a notation that goes back to my father's time and probably before. And what the notation means is that you don't go in there after dark, and you don't go in there alone. And if you're in there and the compass starts to wander, you stop walking and you sit down and you wait. Because the hollow is not confused, you are confused, and the kindest thing the mountain can do for you in that moment is to ask you to be still. The fire in the stove shifts and settles, a log breaking softly along a seam of grain, and the sound is so intimate and so precisely placed in the silence that it seems less like combustion and more like punctuation, a gentle period at the end of a sentence the mountain has been composing for a very long time. The hollows they speak of, and they speak of them the way you might speak of a cathedral you once visited, with reverence and a kind of quiet, wondering gratitude, are not marked on the maps that hikers carry, not indicated by any sign or blazed trail, and they exist in a cartographic space that is less about coordinates than about relationship, less about where they are than about what they are, which is to say that they are places where the ordinary rules that govern the behavior of light and sound and direction seem to soften and blur, not because anything is wrong, but because something is very, very old. Something so ancient that the concepts of wrong and right have not yet been invented in that particular fold of earth. And what remains is simply what was always there before human categories were laid over the landscape, like a grid that the forest tolerates but does not recognize. The canopy in these places closes so completely overhead that the light which reaches the forest floor has been filtered through so many layers of leaf and branch and lichen-covered limb that it arrives not as light exactly, but as a kind of luminous shadow, a green-gold dimness that makes noon feel like the hour before dusk, that makes the air itself seem to glow faintly with the accumulated memory of every photon that has been caught and held and slowly released by these patient, layered leaves over the course of centuries. The moss that covers every surface, every fallen log, every stone, every inch of the forest floor grows so thick and so impossibly soft that walking through these places feels less like walking and more like wading through something that is part carpet, part cloud, part the living pelt of the mountain itself. And if you were to press your palm flat against one of those mossy stones, you would feel a coolness that is not the coolness of absence, but the coolness of depth, the temperature of something that connects through rock and root and the slow percolation of ancient water, all the way down to the quiet, dreaming heart of the mountain where the stone still remembers being the floor of a shallow Paleozoic sea. The camera moves through the forest now with the slow, steady drift of wood smoke rising through still air, passing over the intricate landscape of a single fallen log where shelf fungi grow in overlapping tiers like the pages of a book made entirely of rust and cream and the palest, most delicate lavender. And each fungus is edged with a rim of new growth so white it seems to produce its own faint light. And a beetle makes its way across this landscape with the unhurried determination of a traveler who has no destination but only a direction, pausing now and then to test the air with antennae, so fine they are visible only as a tremor against the soft, luminous background of the forest's permanent twilight. There are sounds here, but they are the sounds that exist beneath sound. The sounds you begin to hear only when the louder world has been peeled away layer by layer. The tick of a water droplet falling from the tip of a rhododendron leaf into the cupped surface of another leaf 6 inches below, the almost subliminal creak of a hemlock trunk adjusting its weight against the slow pull of gravity, the whisper of air moving through the space between two stones in a manner that produces a note so low and so sustained that it seems to vibrate in the bones of your sternum rather than in your ears. And far above all of this, so far above that it belongs to another world entirely, the canopy sways in a wind that never reaches the forest floor, a wind that moves through the treetops with the same vast, unhurried rhythm as the tides that once covered these mountains when they were young. When they stood at the floor of an ocean that has been gone for so long that even the memory of salt has been washed from the stone, replaced by the sweet, dark, loamy quiet of deep time folding gently over itself like a blanket being drawn across the shoulders of someone who is already nearly blissfully asleep. Delia speaks again, her voice arriving like the first cool thread of evening air that finds its way through a screen door just as the light begins to thicken. And she is describing the way certain hollows carry sound, the way a voice spoken at normal volume on one side of a ridge can arrive on the other side as something different, not louder, not quieter, but altered in some fundamental way that she has never been able to adequately describe, but that she recognizes immediately, the way you recognize the smell of rain before it arrives, the way your body knows that the temperature has dropped a single degree before your conscious mind registers the change. We had a call once, maybe 15 years ago, she says, and the lamplight catches the curve of her coffee mug and throws a small, warm crescent of light against the porch railing. A hiker who'd gone off trail somewhere near the head of Persimmon Creek, and we went in after him at dusk, which we don't love to do, but you don't leave someone out there if you can help it. And when we got to the edge of what we call the fold, that's just our name for it. It doesn't have an official name. It's just a place where two ridges come together and create this deep, narrow hollow that catches the mist and holds it. We could hear him. She pauses, and the pause is not dramatic, but rather organic. The natural rest between one breath and the next, the space between one thought settling and another rising. We could hear him talking, just talking quietly to himself, the way people do when they're lost and trying to stay calm, and his voice was coming from everywhere at once. From above us and below us and from inside the mountain itself, and our compass needles were doing that thing they do in there, just drifting in slow, lazy circles like they were dreaming. And Harlan, who was leading that night, he just held up his hand and we all stopped, and we sat down right there on the ridge, and we waited, and an hour later the hiker walked out of the hollow on his own, perfectly fine, calm as anything, and he said the strangest thing. He said that at some point he'd stopped trying to find his way out and just stood still, and the path had come to him. Somewhere beyond the edge of the lamplight, beyond the porch and the road and the sleeping town, a screech owl releases a single tremulous note into the darkness, and the note hangs in the air like a question that requires no answer. From the sound so perfectly suited to the night in the mountains and the deep layered silence of the hollows that it seems less like a bird calling and more like the darkness itself, briefly, gently vibrating. Harlan nods when he hears this story, though he is not in the same room and may not be hearing it at this particular moment. The documentary moves between its voices the way a creek moves between its stones, finding the natural path, the path of least resistance, the path that water has been choosing since before the concept of choice existed. And he picks up a thread of his own, describing the way compass needles behave in certain hollows, not with alarm or bewilderment, but with the same calm. An observational tone one might use to describe the behavior of fireflies at the edge of a meadow or the way certain clouds stack themselves against a ridgeline before a summer storm. The needles drift, he says, and his hands move in a slow circular motion that mirrors the movement he is describing. Not fast, not spinning, just drifting, the way a leaf drifts on the surface of a still pond when there's no wind but there's something underneath, some current, some slow, deep movement that you can't see but you can feel. And the old-timers, my father and his father and theirs, they never worried about it much. They just said the mountain was thinking, the way you might say a person was thinking when they got quiet and still and their eyes went soft and they'd put their compasses away and navigate by other things. By the way the moss grew, by the direction the hemlocks leaned, by the sound of water and the feel of the air on their skin. He reaches down and places another piece of wood on the fire, and the wood is cherry, and the cherry releases its fragrance into the warm air of the room, a scent that is sweet and slightly sharp, and carries within it the memory of a tree that grew slowly on a south-facing slope where the sun arrived first each morning and stayed longest each evening. And the fire receives it with a soft exhalation of sparks that rise and cool and vanish before they reach the blackened stones of the chimney's throat, tiny orange stars winking out one by one as though falling asleep in the middle of their own brief, beautiful lives. There are geological explanations for some of these phenomena, the documentary acknowledges, and it presents them not as debunkings, but as additional layers of wonder. Because the science of these mountains is itself a kind of poetry, a story told in magnetite deposits and fault lines and the crystalline structure of rocks that formed under pressures and temperatures so extreme that they exist now in a state that is technically impossible, a state that the stone maintains through sheer stubbornness, through the memory locked in its molecular bonds, through the same quiet persistence that allows a hemlock to grow for 600 years on a ledge that seems to offer nothing but rock and shadow and the thin, mineral-rich trickle of water that seeps from a crack no wider than a pencil. The magnetic anomalies are real, measurable, are documented. Pockets of iron-rich rock that create local variations in the magnetic field, strong enough to confuse a compass, strong enough to make a needle wander in exactly the slow, dreaming circles that Harlan describes. And the acoustic peculiarities are real as well, products of the particular geometry of these hollows, the way sound bounces between parallel rock faces and is absorbed by dense vegetation, and is bent by temperature inversions that form when cold air pools in the valley bottoms beneath a layer of warmer air above, creating a lens of atmosphere that refracts sound the way a lens of glass refracts light. But knowing this does not diminish the wonder, and the documentary is careful to make this clear, presenting the science and the folklore not as competing explanations, but as two languages describing the same enormous, incomprehensible, beautiful fact that these mountains are so old and so complex and so deeply, intricately alive that they continue to surprise and humble the people who have lived among them for centuries, the way the night sky continues to surprise and humble even the astronomers who can name every star. Because naming a thing and understanding a thing and being filled with wordless awe by a thing are three entirely different acts, and the last of these is perhaps the most honest and the most human. And it is certainly the one that comes most naturally when you are standing alone in a hollow so old that the stone beneath your feet was already ancient when the dinosaurs were young, and the mist is rising, and the compass is dreaming, and the forest is holding you in its vast, unhurried, infinitely patient embrace. A third voice enters the documentary now, a woman named June, who serves as the team's navigator and map keeper, and her voice has the particular clarity of creek water running over a bed of smooth, clean stones, not sharp, never sharp, but precise in the way that natural things are precise, the way a spider's web is precise, the way the vein pattern in a sourwood leaf is precise, achieving complexity not through effort, but through the patient accumulation of tiny, perfect decisions repeated over time. She sits at a table spread with maps, and the maps are layered one over another like the geological strata of the mountains themselves, the oldest at the bottom, hand-drawn on paper so soft with age that it feels more like cloth than like anything that was ever made from a tree, and the newest on top, printed in the flat, the confident colors of modern cartography, and between them, layer upon layer, the record of how these mountains have been seen and named and navigated and loved by the people who have lived among them, each map a palimpsest, each contour line a story, each penciled notation in a margin a small, careful prayer. There are coordinates on these maps, she says, her finger tracing a line along a ridge that the paper has rendered as a tight nest of concentric brown lines that have been marked by every generation of search and rescue in this county. Going back to before it was called search and rescue, back to when it was just neighbors helping neighbors find their way home. And the marks all say the same thing, which is that these places require a different kind of attention, a different kind of respect, and that the safest thing you can do when you encounter them is to slow down, to get quiet, to let your breathing settle, and to trust that the mountain is not trying to confuse you, but is simply operating on a different scale than you are. A scale where 100 years is a single breath and 1,000 years is a heartbeat, and the entire span of human habitation in these hollows is just the faintest flicker, the gentlest pulse, in a rhythm that began before the Atlantic Ocean existed and will continue long after the continents have drifted into configurations we cannot imagine. The lamp above the table casts a warm circle of light that illuminates the maps in her hands and the coffee-stained edge of a mug that holds the ghost of 100 late-night planning sessions. And beyond that circle, the room softens into shadow. And beyond the shadow, the windows reveal the black shapes of mountains against a sky that is not empty but full of stars, full of the slow-turning architecture of galaxies, full of the same deep, patient darkness that fills the hollows, a darkness that is not the enemy of light but its complement, its resting place, the soft bed into which the day gratefully sinks each evening like a body settling into the familiar, welcoming contours of sleep. The documentary pauses here, as it will pause several more times throughout its unhurried length, to simply be in the forest, to offer long, unnarrated passages where the camera moves through the landscape with the same slow, drifting purposelessness of mist. And these passages are gifts, invitations to let the thinking mind rest and to allow the older, deeper mind, the mind that knows how to breathe without being told, the mind that keeps the heart beating through the long watches of the night, to take over, to do what it has always done best, which is simply to receive, to be present, to feel the texture of the world without needing to name or explain or categorize it. Here is a stream, and the water moves over stones that have been polished to the color of smoke and honey and the darkest, most saturated green. And each stone cradles a small, constantly shifting sculpture of moving water that catches the dim light and breaks it into fragments that dance and merge and dissolve and reform in patterns so complex that no mathematics could describe them. And yet they occur with a naturalness and an ease that suggests that the universe finds complexity no more difficult than simplicity, that the elaborate is as effortless as the plain, that the most intricate and beautiful things in existence require no effort at all, but only the willingness to let water flow and light fall and time accumulate in its slow, generous, unhurried way. Here is a spider's web strung between two rhododendron branches, and the web is beaded with moisture that catches the twilight and holds it in tiny, trembling spheres, each one a complete, self-contained world reflecting the forest in miniature, and the spider sits at the center with the stillness of something that has understood a secret so simple and so profound that it requires no movement, no speech, no thought, only presence, only the willingness to be exactly where it is, doing exactly what it does, in exactly this moment that is no different from any other moment, and yet is also somehow the only moment that has ever existed. And here, far above, visible through a rare gap in the canopy, a single star appears in the darkening sky, and it burns with a light that left its surface years ago and has been traveling through the void ever since, patient and silent and unbothered by distance. And the fact that it arrives here, now, in this hollow, touching this web, illuminating this water, seems less like coincidence and more like the kind of thing the universe has been quietly arranging since the beginning, placing each element with the same care that the mountain places its stones, which is to say, no care at all and infinite care simultaneously, the way a sleeping body arranges itself into comfort without any conscious decision, the way breathing continues through the night without anyone choosing to breathe. Harlan is speaking again, and this time he is describing a particular night many years ago when he went into one of the marked hollows alone, the only time he has ever done so, and the way he describes it makes it clear that he went not out of recklessness or curiosity, but out of a kind of calling, the way a person might feel called to sit beside a fire or walk to the edge of the ocean at night. Not because there is anything to see or do, but because something in the body recognizes that this is a moment for witnessing, for being present to something larger than oneself. It was October, he says, and the word carries the weight of everything October means in these mountains, the color that pours down the ridges like slow fire, the sharpness of the air that arrives in the mornings like a gift wrapped in frost, the way the light changes from the warm gold of summer to something thinner and more honest, a light that hides nothing and illuminates everything with a clarity that is almost painful in its beauty. And I'd been out marking trail for a search we were planning to run the next morning, and I came to the edge of the fold just as the sun dropped behind the western ridge. It is Saint-Jean. And the light did that thing it does in October, where it turns everything to amber, just for a moment. And then the shadow comes up from the valley floor like water rising, and I stood there and watched the shadow fill the hollow, and I don't know why, but I walked in. He pauses, and the fire pops softly in the stove, a small percussion that keeps time with the silence the way a heartbeat keeps time with sleep. And it was the quietest place I've ever been, and I have been in some quiet places in my life. But this was a quiet that had layers, like the forest itself, layer after layer going down. And the deeper I went, the quieter it got, until I realized I couldn't hear my own footsteps, not because the moss was that thick, though it was, but because the quiet had a kind of weight to it that absorbed everything, that took every sound and held it and gentled it down to nothing, the way deep water takes a stone and lowers it so slowly to the bottom that by the time it arrives, it makes no sound at all. He stops, and his eyes move to the window, where the mountains are visible as dark shapes against the sky, and his expression is not one of fear or even of memory exactly, but of gratitude, the deep, settled gratitude of a man who was once given a gift he did not ask for and has spent the rest of his life simply being worthy of it. I sat down on a log, and I stayed there for maybe 2 hours, and the moon came up, and the moonlight came down through the canopy in these thin, silver threads, like the forest was being stitched to the sky, and I could feel the mountain breathing, not hear it, feel it, this slow, deep rhythm that was not my rhythm and not any animal's rhythm, but something older, something that belonged to the stone itself. And I sat there, and I breathed with it, and when I finally stood up and walked out, the compass was working fine, and the trail was right where it had always been, and the stars were in their proper places. And I have never been afraid of those hollows, not once, not ever, because what I felt in there was not menace, it was not danger, it was rest. It was the deepest, most complete, most ancient rest I have ever felt, as though the mountain had been resting since the beginning of time and had invited me, just for a moment, to rest with it. The forest at night in these mountains is not the forest of imagination, not the threatening dark of fairy tales or the anxious unknown of horror. It is something else entirely, something that the voices in this documentary keep circling back to with the same wondering insistence, the way a moth circles a lamp not out of compulsion, but out of devotion. And what they keep describing, each in their own way, each from their own decades of experience and their own family's accumulated wisdom, is a darkness that is not empty but full, not hostile but sheltering, not the opposite of home, but perhaps the original home, the first home, the darkness of the womb and the darkness of deep sleep, and the darkness that exists between stars, a darkness so vast and so complete that it becomes indistinguishable from peace. The forest floor at night is alive with small, quiet activities, the rustle of a vole moving through the leaf litter with the focused, businesslike energy of someone who knows exactly where they are going, the slow unfurling of a fiddlehead fern that has been waiting all day for the cool privacy of night to do its growing, the microscopic click and hum of decomposition as a billion organisms work together to turn this year's fallen leaves into next year's soil, a collaboration so intricate and so perfectly coordinated that it makes the most complex human endeavors look crude and clumsy by comparison. The temperature drops by a degree, and then another, and then another, and each degree of cooling is like a layer of blanket being drawn up, the air itself becoming denser and softer and more present, pressing gently against the skin the way deep water presses against a diver, and the moisture that has been invisible all day begins to condense on every surface, on the underside of every leaf, on the bark of every tree, on the strands of every spider's web, until the entire forest is beaded with water, glistening faintly in whatever light reaches it, and the forest becomes a palace of small, silent jewels, each droplet holding a tiny, inverted image of the world. And the cumulative effect of all this moisture is to thicken the air, to slow it down, to give it weight and substance until breathing feels less like an automatic act and more like a conversation, an exchange, a gentle negotiation between the body and the atmosphere in which both parties give and both parties receive. And the rhythm of this exchange slows, deepens, settles, the way all rhythms in these mountains eventually slow and deepen and settle. Pulled by the same ancient gravity that pulls the water down through the stone and the leaves down through the air and the eyelids down, over the eyes, as the body recognizes what the mountain has always known, which is that rest is not something you do, but something you surrender to, something that has been waiting for you all along with the infinite patience of 400 million years of practice. June is describing the maps again, and this time she has pulled out the oldest one, the one at the bottom of the stack, the one drawn by a hand that has been still for more than a century, and she handles it with the same care one might use to hold a sleeping child or a bird's egg or a letter from someone who has been gone a very long time, her fingers barely touching the edges where the paper has gone soft and golden with age. Look here, she says, and her voice is barely above a whisper, not because she's trying to be quiet, but because the object in her hand seems to demand quietness, the way a candle flame demands stillness. This line here, this is the same ridge we call Nolan Ridge today. And this notation here, in this handwriting that we think belongs to a man named Ezekiel Combs who was born in 1841, this notation says the same thing our notations say, in different words but the same meaning. It says that this hollow is a place of deep quiet, and that the way through it is to stop trying to find the way through it, and that the compass will return to itself when you return to yourself. She sets the map down and places her palm flat on its surface. And the gesture is so tender and so complete that it seems less like touching a piece of paper and more like placing a hand on the chest of the mountain itself, feeling the heartbeat that Harlan described, the slow, stone-deep rhythm that has been beating since before the first map was drawn, since before the first word was spoken, since before the first eye opened on a world that was already, even then, ancient and beautiful and wrapped in the same layered darkness that wraps these hollows now, holding them safe, holding them still, holding them in the same patient, eternal embrace that holds the sleeper as the last thread of consciousness loosens, and the mind releases its grip on the day, and the body becomes, at last, exactly as heavy and as warm and as perfectly surrenderingly still as the mountain has been trying to teach it to be since the very first breath. The documentary has been playing for some time now, and you've been listening the way one listens to rain on a roof, not with active attention, but with something softer and more permeable, a kind of listening that happens in the body rather than in the mind, a listening that allows the sounds and the images and the slowly unfolding voices to move through you the way water moves through sand, filtering downward through layer after layer of thought and memory, and the small, daily accumulations of tension until it reaches the quiet place at the bottom, the place that is always there, always waiting, the place that the mountain knows, and the forest knows, and the mist knows, and the ancient, iron-rich stone knows, the place where everything is still, and everything is held, and everything is, at last, at rest. There is a long passage now where the camera follows a creek through one of the hollows, and the creek is so clear that the stones at its bottom seem to float in liquid glass, and the water makes a sound that is not a single sound, but a chord. A harmony of 1,000 tiny impacts and flows and eddies that blend together into something so complete and so continuous that after a while you stop hearing it as sound and start feeling it as texture, as temperature, as the gentle, unceasing vibration of a world that is always in motion but never in a hurry. And the banks of the creek are lined with Christmas ferns that stay green all winter long, their fronds arching over the water with the grace of hands held out in blessing, and the ferns are so still that they seem to be listening too, attending to the same ancient sermon that the water has been preaching since before the first fern uncurled its first fiddlehead from the dark, rich soil. And above the ferns, and above the rhododendron, and above the hemlock and the tulip poplar and the ancient, patient oak, the sky is doing what the sky has always done in these mountains at night, which is to open like a door into a room so vast that the mind cannot hold it, a room made of distance and silence and the slow, turning light of stars that are themselves older than anything on this earth, older than the mountains, older than the stone, older than the water, older than the idea of age itself, and the fact that this room exists above you every single night, whether you look at it or not, whether you notice it or not, whether you are awake or asleep or suspended in that sweet, dissolving space between the two, is perhaps the most comforting fact in the universe, because it means that the enormous is always there, that the ancient is always there, that the vast sheltering dark that holds these mountains and these hollows and these creeks and these voices is the same dark that holds the galaxies, and it has been holding them since the beginning, and it will hold them until the end, and it is holding you now, gently, completely, with the same unhurried, inexhaustible tenderness with which it holds everything. Delia is remembering her grandmother now, and the memory arrives in her voice the way warmth arrives in a room when someone opens the door of a wood stove, gradually, then all at once, filling every corner. She used to say that the mountains were sleeping, that they'd been sleeping since before we came and they'd be sleeping long after we left, and that when we went into the deep hollows, we were walking through their dreams, and that's why things were different in there. Not wrong, just different. The way things in a dream are different from things in waking life, but not less real, maybe more real. Because in a dream, everything means something and nothing is wasted, and every detail is connected to every other detail by threads that you can feel but can't see. And the moss and the mist and the way the compass drifts and the way sound bends and the way you can feel the mountain breathing. All of that is just what it feels like to be inside something else's dream, something enormous and old and peaceful. And the most important thing is to move gently and speak softly and not try to impose your own dream on top of theirs. She takes a sip of her chicory coffee, and the sound of the liquid in the cup is a small, intimate thing, a sound that belongs to kitchens and porches and the quiet hours of late evening when the world has contracted to the size of a warm room and a single lamp and the company of one's own thoughts. And I've carried that with me every time I've gone into those hollows, every search, every rescue, every time I've stood at the edge and felt the quiet come up from the valley floor like rising water. And I've never argued with the mountain, and I've never tried to make it conform to what I thought it should be. And in return, the mountain has always, always brought me home. Outside. The night has deepened into that particular quality of darkness that exists only in the hours long past midnight, a darkness that is not dramatic or intense, but simply complete, simply present, simply itself, and the mountains stand within it like great sleeping animals, their breath the wind that moves through the ridgetop trees, their pulse the slow, deep rhythm of water moving through stone, their dreams the mist that rises and falls in the hollows with the same gentle, ceaseless motion that governs the rise and fall of a sleeper's chest. And everything, the town, the porches, the voices, the maps, the memories, the ancient stone beneath it all, is held within this darkness the way a word is held within a silence, the way a seed is held within the earth, the way sleep is held within the body, waiting, always waiting. A patient beyond any human understanding of patience for the moment of letting go. There are practical things the search and rescue team does, and the documentary covers these with the same unhurried thoroughness with which it covers everything. Because the practical and the mysterious are not separate categories in these mountains, but are woven together so tightly that you cannot pull one thread without disturbing the other. They carry 2 compasses and a GPS unit, and they know that in certain hollows only the GPS will work, and in certain other hollows nothing electronic will work at all, and they carry a detailed knowledge of the terrain that is stored not in any device, but in their bodies, in their feet and their hands, in the particular way their inner ears respond to the slope of the ground beneath them. A knowledge that has been accumulating through generations, the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a still pool, layer upon layer, each generation adding its own thin stratum of experience and observation to the deep, rich deposit of everything that came before. They carry whistles, and they carry headlamps, and they carry emergency blankets that are silver on one side and gold on the other, and that crinkle with a sound like autumn leaves when you unfold them. And they carry food and water and first aid supplies, and they carry something else that does not appear on any equipment list. But that is perhaps the most essential thing of all, which is a quality of attention, a willingness to notice, a capacity for the kind of deep, embodied listening that allows a person to stand in a hollow where the compass is drifting and the sound is bending and the mist is rising, and to feel not panic, but recognition, not confusion, but a deepening of presence, as though the mountain's strangeness is not something to be solved, but something to be participated in, the way a musician participates in a song, the way a sleeper participates in a dream, with full immersion and no resistance, and the understanding that the experience is being given to you, that it is a gift, that the appropriate response is not analysis, but gratitude. The documentary is moving toward its close now, though close is perhaps the wrong word, because nothing in this film ends exactly. It simply fades, the way a note fades after a bell has been struck, the way the last light fades from the sky at the end of an October evening, the way a thought fades as sleep approaches, losing its edges, losing its insistence, losing everything that made it a thought and becoming instead a feeling, a color, a warmth, a weight, a slow, gentle, downward drift into something that has been waiting for you all along. Harlan speaks one more time, and his voice has dropped to a register that is almost subsonic, a frequency that you feel in your chest the way you feel the bass note of a distant church bell. And he is saying something about the mountain being the same thing as sleep, or sleep being the same thing as the mountain, or both of them being the same thing as the darkness that holds everything. And his words are not quite words anymore. They are textures, they are temperatures. They are the feeling of warm air against skin, and the weight of a wool blanket, and the sound of a fire that is burned down to coals so deep and so steady that they will hold their heat until morning. And you realize that you have stopped distinguishing between his voice and the sound of the creek and the sound of the wind in the high canopy and the sound of your own breathing, that all of these sounds have merged into a single, continuous, seamless hum that is both infinitely complex and infinitely simple, both the most elaborate symphony ever composed and the most basic, primal, essential sound in the universe, the sound of things being exactly as they are, the sound of the present moment extending in every direction without limit, the sound of rest. The last images are of the forest at dawn, though dawn is not quite the right word for what happens in these hollows. It is more like a gradual lightening, a slow increase in luminosity that has no obvious source, as though the forest is not being illuminated by the sun, but is instead remembering its own light, recalling the photons it held yesterday and the day before, and every day stretching back through centuries, releasing them slowly, gently, the way a stone releases heat after the fire has gone out, and the first color to return is green, the deep, absolute, encompassing green of moss and fern and rhododendron and hemlock, a green so saturated and so pervasive that it does not seem like a color at all, but like a fundamental property of reality, like gravity or time or the tendency of water to find the lowest point. Yin, and this green fills the hollow the way sleep fills a body, completely, effortlessly, leaving no empty spaces, no gaps, no places where anything is lacking or incomplete. A wood thrush sings, and its song is a series of flute-like phrases that spiral upward through the canopy like the smoke from a fire that has been burning since before the mountains rose, and each phrase ends with a small crystalline trill that seems to shatter the silence into 1,000 bright fragments that immediately reassemble themselves into a silence that is somehow deeper and more complete than the silence that came before. As though the song has not broken the quiet, but has added to it, has enriched it, has demonstrated that silence and sound are not opposites, but partners, two aspects of the same enormous, breathing, living stillness that has been the subject of this entire documentary, the stillness that the search and rescue teams navigate by, the stillness that the maps try to record, the stillness that fills the hollows in the valleys and the folds of these ancient, patient, endlessly generous mountains. And the camera pulls back, slowly, as though reluctant to leave, rising through the canopy layer by layer, through the understory of spicebush and dogwood, through the midstory of redbud and sourwood, through the overstory of oak and tulip poplar and the towering magnificent hemlocks, until it breaks through the top and the whole world opens up in every direction, ridge after ridge after ridge, receding into the blue haze of distance, each one older than the last, each one deeper in sleep. And the sky above them is the color of a promise that has already been kept, pale and clear and holding nothing but light and the slow turning motion of a planet that has been spinning in this same darkness for 4.5 billion years, cradled in the arm of a galaxy that is itself cradled in the arm of something larger, and larger still, and larger still, until the scale exceeds the capacity of the mind to hold it, and the mind does what the compass does in the deep hollows. It stops trying, it lets go, it drifts, it dreams. And in dreaming it finds its way home to the quiet place at the center of everything, the place that has no coordinates because it is everywhere, the place that has no name because it is the thing that names come from. The place that the mountains have been guarding and holding and breathing into existence since before the first star ignited in the dark. And you are there now. You have always been there. You are held. You are safe. You are resting in the oldest cradle in the world, and the mountain is breathing, and you are breathing with it, and the darkness is not empty. The darkness is full, and it is full of you. Somewhere, very far away, on a lamplit porch in a small town pressed into the crease between two ridges, Delia sets down her coffee mug and looks out at the mountains and says, to no one in particular and to everyone who has ever listened, the mountain is sleeping, and it has always been sleeping, and it is dreaming us, all of us, every one of us. And the dream is kind, and her voice fades into the sound of the creek, fading into the sound of the wind, fading into the sound of breathing, fading into the sound of silence. And the silence is not empty. The silence is the fullest thing there is, and it holds you, and it has always held you, and it will hold you tonight as the mountains hold the mist, completely, gently, without effort, without end. For the mountains are old beyond imagining and patient beyond measure, and they have been practicing this holding, this cradling, this infinite, sheltering, all-encompassing rest for 400 million years. And they are very, very good at it, and you can trust them, the way you trust the ground beneath you, the way you trust the darkness when you close your eyes, the way you trust the breath that comes without your asking. Steady and slow and warm, carrying you down and down and down into the deepest, softest, most ancient sleep there is. There is a sound that the oldest hemlock trees make when the wind dies completely, a sound that is not quite silence and not quite speech, but something closer to the long, slow settling of a house after everyone inside has finally fallen asleep, a faint ticking and sighing in the heartwood as the sap adjusts itself to the cooling night air. And it was this sound, barely perceptible, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears, that the woman named Della Combs once described to her granddaughter as the mountains remembering how to breathe, the way they had breathed long before there were ears to listen, long before the first fern uncurled its impossible green question into the Devonian air. When these ridges stood tall as the Alps, and the only witnesses to their glory were the slow rivers of stone still flowing beneath the crust of the dreaming earth. Della's kitchen smelled of black walnut and lard and the particular sweetness of birch bark tea left to steep too long on the back of a wood stove, whose cast iron had been seasoned by 60 years of hands and heat and the invisible residue of 10,000 suppers, and the warmth that radiated from its surface was not merely thermal, but temporal, a warmth that seemed to reach backward and forward through time simultaneously, connecting the cold November evening pressing against the window panes to every other cold evening that had ever pressed against this glass. Every other night when someone had sat in this chair and watched the fire shift and listened to the darkness gathering in the hollow below like water filling a bowl, slow and sure and patient beyond all human reckoning, the way darkness has always gathered in these particular hollows, pooling in the places between the ridges where the mountains fold inward upon themselves and create spaces so sheltered from light that the mosses growing there have evolved a softness found nowhere else on the continent. The granddaughter, who was 9, and whose name was Birdie, and whose hair smelled of wood smoke and the cold mineral sweetness of creek water, pressed her back against the warmth of her grandmother's knees and watched the fire without blinking. The way children do when they are not yet ready for sleep but are no longer entirely committed to wakefulness, suspended in that liminal hour when the body grows heavy and the mind grows light, and every story told in a low voice becomes a kind of doorway into somewhere older and deeper than the room where it is being told. And Della's voice, when it came, was not much louder than the fire itself, a murmur worn smooth by years of repetition, the way creek stones are worn smooth by the ceaseless, unhurried passage of water over their surfaces, decade after decade, century after century, until what remains is something so perfectly rounded that it fits the palm of a hand, as though it were made to be held there. She said, "There are places in these mountains that belong to the dark the way a creek bed belongs to its water." And she said it the way she said everything, without hurry, without emphasis, as though she were simply describing the color of the sky or the temperature of the morning, a fact so fundamental and so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life that it required no drama in the telling, only the quiet acknowledgement that the world is larger and older and stranger than any single life can compass, and that this largeness, this oldness, this strangeness is not something to flee from, but something to settle into the way one settles into a quilt on a cold night, pulling the weight of it over the body like a blessing, like the accumulated warmth of every hand that stitched its pieces together. The documentary crew arrived in Harlan County on a Tuesday in late October, when the sourwood trees had turned the color of dark honey, and the sugar maples were burning in shades of amber and rust along every ridge that caught the afternoon sun. And the quality of the light itself seemed thickened somehow, golden and heavy and slow, as though the atmosphere had absorbed some essence of the turning leaves, and now carried it suspended in every beam that slanted through the hollows, touching the weathered wood of fence posts and porch rails, and turning them momentarily precious, luminous, as though each plank of chestnut oak still remembered the living tree from which it had been taken, and was, for this one brief season, allowed to glow again with that remembered life. The director, a quiet woman from Asheville named Marin, who wore her gray hair in a braid that reached the middle of her back and who had spent 20 years making films about landscapes that most people drove through without stopping, sat for a long time in the passenger seat of the van after they had parked at the end of the gravel road, simply looking at the way the mountains arranged themselves against the sky, ridge behind ridge behind ridge, each one a slightly different shade of blue-gray, the nearest dark as wood smoke, the farthest so pale it was almost indistinguishable from the sky itself, and she thought, not for the first time, that there was no other landscape on earth that conveyed such a profound sense of geological patience, such a visible record of time's slow and tender erosion. We said these mountains that had once scraped the heavens, now worn down to the gentle rolling shapes of sleeping bodies beneath a blanket of oak and hickory and pine. She turned to her sound engineer, a young man named Cole, whose ears were so sensitive that he could distinguish between the sound of wind passing through white pine and wind passing through Virginia pine from 50 yards away. And she said very softly, as though the mountains themselves were listening, "I want to understand why they don't go in." And Cole nodded slowly without looking at her, his eyes fixed on a particular fold in the ridgeline to the southeast, where the forest seemed to darken abruptly, not with shadow exactly, but with a kind of intensification, a gathering of depth, as though the trees in that fold were older or closer together or somehow more emphatically themselves than the trees on either side, and the silence that came from that direction was not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence, the silence of something very large and very old that has no need to announce itself, because it has been here longer than language, longer than the concept of announcement, longer than the slow parade of species that have climbed these slopes and sheltered in these hollows and listened to the same silence, and known, in whatever wordless way their bodies permitted, that some silences are not empty, but full to the very brim. The first person they interviewed was a retired search and rescue volunteer named Earl Tolbert, who was 73 years old, and who had the kind of hands that told the story of a life spent gripping rope and rock and the collars of frightened dogs and the arms of people who had wandered too far from the trail and found themselves disoriented in country that seemed to shift and rearrange itself in the absence of sunlight. And Earl sat on the porch of his house on Piney Ridge with a cup of coffee that steamed in the cool October air like a small and temporary ghost. And he spoke in the same unhurried cadence that Della Combs had used, that all the people in these mountains seemed to use, a rhythm that was less about conveying information than about inhabiting time, about letting each word find its own weight and settle into the space between speaker and listener, the way a leaf settles onto the surface of a still pond, barely disturbing the water, becoming part of its stillness. "I went in 427 times over 31 years, Earl said, and he looked out at the mountains as he said it, not at Marin or at the camera, and his eyes had the quality of water that's very deep and very clear and reflects the sky so perfectly that you cannot tell where the surface ends and the depth begins. And I brought out 392 people alive, and I sat with 11 who were not alive anymore, and I carried them out too because nobody should have to stay out there if they don't belong to it. And I learned every trail and every creek crossing and every ridge path in this county and 4 counties around it, and I could walk them at night by feel, by the sound the ground made under my boots, by the way the air tasted at different elevations." And he paused, and the pause was not empty, but full, a held breath, a moment of acknowledgement for something he was about to say that he had carried for a long time, the way these mountains carry the memory of their former height in the chemistry of their stones. "But there are places I would not go," he said, and he said it simply, without drama, the way you might say the sun rises in the east or the creek runs downhill, and the camera captured the way his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the ceramic mug, a gesture so small that only someone paying the most exquisite attention would notice it, the way the tendons in the backs of his hands shifted beneath skin that was thin and brown as autumn leaves. Not because I was afraid, you understand, though I suppose some people would call it that, but because I learned. The way you learn not to touch a hot stove, that those places have their own rules, their own time, their own way of being. And a person who goes in there thinking they understand the dark because they have walked other dark places is like a person who thinks they understand the ocean because they have stood in a puddle. Marin asked him, very gently, what he meant by their own time. And Earl considered this for a while, turning the mug slowly in his hands as though the answer might be written somewhere on its surface. And then he said, "You know how when you go deep into a cave, deep enough that no light from the entrance reaches you, your body starts to lose track of minutes, and an hour feels like 10 minutes, or 10 minutes feels like an hour, and the only clock you have is your own heartbeat, which starts to seem unreliable, like it might be speeding up or slowing down without telling you. And Marin nodded, and Earl said, "It is like that. But the cave is made of trees and sky, and the darkness is not above you and below you, but all around you and inside you, and your heartbeat does not seem unreliable so much as it seems borrowed, temporary, a small rhythm ticking inside a much larger rhythm that has been beating since before the first rain fell on these mountains. And you feel, not with your mind but with your bones, that you are standing in a place where time pools the way water pools in a low place, and if you stay too long you might forget which current is yours, which flow leads back to the morning, to the kitchen, to the coffee going cold on the porch. The phenomenon that the documentary sought to understand, or rather, to sit beside without requiring understanding, the way one sits beside a deep river and does not ask it to explain its depth, had been documented in fragments across more than 2 centuries of Appalachian record-keeping in the journals of surveyors who noted that their compasses behaved strangely in certain hollows, the needles swinging in slow, deliberate arcs that suggested not malfunction, but attention, as though the instruments were tracking the movement of something vast and invisible passing through the magnetic field of the earth itself. And in the field notes of botanists from the Smithsonian who ventured into the Appalachian ranges in the 1880s and described forests where the canopy was so dense and so ancient that the light reaching the forest floor had the quality of light at the bottom of the sea, a dim, greenish, or directionless illumination that seemed to emanate from the mosses themselves rather than filtering down from any visible sky. There were accounts in county historical societies written in the careful, slanted hand of schoolteachers and postmasters and circuit-riding preachers, describing areas where dogs would not go, where horses would plant their hooves and refuse to move forward with a stubbornness that their owners knew better than to challenge. And these accounts were remarkable, not for their fear, but for their matter-of-factness. The same tone Earl Tolbert used, the same tone Della Combs used, the tone of people describing a feature of their landscape as natural and unremarkable as a spring or a salt lick, or a place where the rhododendrons grew so thick that they formed tunnels you could walk through for a quarter mile without seeing the sky. And in every account there was the same implicit understanding that the darkness in these zones was not the ordinary darkness of nightfall or cloud cover or dense forest canopy, but something qualitatively different, something that had weight and texture and temperature, a darkness you could feel against your skin the way you feel the approach of a thunderstorm, a change in pressure, a thickening of the air that the body registers before the mind has words for it. The earliest reference Marin's team found was in the journal of a Welsh surveyor named Gruffydd Evan Price, who had been commissioned in 1796 to map the watershed boundaries along the Kentucky-Virginia border, and who wrote, in an entry dated the 14th of September, that he had entered a hollow following a creek he called Darkling Branch, a name that persists on no modern map, but which the older residents of the area still used, Marin would later learn, speaking it softly and with a respect that bordered on tenderness, and that upon entering this hollow, the light changed in a manner he could not adequately describe, growing not merely dim but thick, as though the air itself had become somehow more substantial, and that his surveying chain, which was 66 feet of iron links that he had used without incident across hundreds of miles of wilderness, began to feel heavier in his hands, not dramatically but perceptibly, the way a blanket feels heavier when it is wet. And he wrote that the trees in this hollow were of a kind he did not recognize, enormously old, their bark so deeply furrowed that a man could lay his whole hand inside the grooves, and that the silence was of a quality he had encountered only once before, in the crypt of a cathedral in Bangor, where the stones had been absorbing prayers for 800 years. Cole set up his recording equipment at the edge of one of these zones on an evening in late October, when the temperature was dropping steadily, and the air smelled of frost and leaf mold, and the faint sweet decay of fallen apples from an orchard that had gone wild decades ago, its trees now gnarled and unpruned, but still producing fruit that no one gathered, small and tart and russeted, accumulating on the ground in fragrant drifts that the deer came to eat at dusk. And he sat very still beside his microphones as the light faded and the forest shifted from the warm amber of late afternoon through the gray violet of twilight into a darkness that was, at first, perfectly ordinary. The kind of darkness that falls on any forest in autumn as the sun drops behind the western ridge, and the sky holds its color for a while longer, a deep blue-green that darkens from the bottom up like a glass being slowly filled with ink. But then, perhaps an hour after full dark, Cole noticed that the darkness in the hollow below him had acquired a different quality from the darkness on the ridge where he sat, and the difference was subtle at first. Noticeable only because he had trained himself over years to perceive the finest gradations of auditory and atmospheric change, and what he noticed was that the darkness below was not passive but active, not an absence of light but a presence of something else, something that absorbed sound the way deep snow absorbs sound, creating a hush that was not silence but a muffling, a gentling, a softening of every ambient noise until the ordinary forest sounds, the creaking of branches, the rustle of small mammals in the leaf litter, the distant interrogative call of a barred owl, simply stopped at a boundary he could feel but not see, and a line in the air beyond which the acoustic properties of the world changed as abruptly and as completely as the temperature changes when you wade from a sun-warmed shallows into the cold current of a mountain river's deepest channel. He recorded for 7 hours that night, hardly moving, breathing as slowly and as quietly as he could, and when he played the recordings back the next morning in the warmth of the motel room, wearing headphones that cost more than most people's first car and that could reproduce frequencies at the very edge of human perception, he heard something that made him set down his coffee and close his eyes and sit very still for a long time, not in fear, but in the kind of reverent, stunned attention that one gives to the first notes of a piece of music one has waited a lifetime to hear. A low, sustained tone at approximately 14 hertz, just below the threshold of conscious hearing, a frequency that the human body perceives not as sound but as feeling, a vibration in the chest cavity, a resonance in the bones of the skull. And this tone was not mechanical or artificial but organic, rising and falling with the slow regularity of breath, and it seemed to emanate from the earth itself, from the deep Precambrian roots of the mountains where the oldest rocks on the continent lay folded and compressed beneath billions of years of accumulated silence, singing to themselves in a register that only the most sensitive instruments and the most attentive bodies could detect. A lullaby older than sleep itself, older than the concept of lullabies. But a vibration that had been humming through these hollows since before the mountains had names, since before there were voices to name them, a sound as patient and as encompassing as the darkness that carried it. In the community of Sago, which was not so much a town as a gathering of houses along a creek that bore the same name, connected by a road that had been gravel for as long as anyone could remember, and that wound along the base of a ridge so steep that the sun did not reach the lower porches until nearly 10 in the morning. During the short days of winter, the documentary crew found a tradition so deeply woven into daily life that the people who practiced it no longer thought of it as a tradition at all, but simply as the way things were done, the way breathing is done, without decision, without deliberation, an inheritance carried in the body rather than the mind. And this tradition was the telling of what the residents called the boundary stories, narratives passed from grandparent to grandchild in the kitchen-lit hours between supper and sleep. Stories that described with extraordinary geographical precision exactly where one could walk freely and where one ought to turn back, not abruptly, not in flight, but slowly, respectfully, the way you might back away from a sleeping animal, not because you feared it would harm you, but because you understood that its sleep was sacred and its dreams were not for your eyes. A woman named Opal Church, who was 86 and who had been born in the same house where she now sat, in the same room, in the same bed whose headboard her grandfather had carved from a single plank of black cherry in 1911, told Marn that the boundary stories were always told in the same way, in a voice just above a whisper, with the child lying down and the teller sitting close, and that the stories always began with the same phrase. The mountain has a heart, and the heart has a door, and the door is always open, but it does not open for us. and that this phrase was not a warning but a lullaby, a way of teaching children that the world contained mysteries that were not problems to be solved, but truths to be accepted, held gently in the mind the way one holds a firefly in cupped hands, aware that the light is borrowed, temporary, not and all the more beautiful for being so. And Opal said that she could remember lying in this bed as a small girl, the quilt pulled up to her chin, her grandmother's voice so soft it blended with the sound of the creek outside the window. And she could not tell where the story ended and the dream began, and she said that perhaps that was the point, that the boundary between story and dream was itself one of the boundaries the stories were teaching her to recognize and to honor. For some thresholds are not meant to be crossed, but simply known, acknowledged, held in the awareness the way the body holds the knowledge of its own heartbeat, constant and essential and rarely noticed, but always, always there. The boundary stories, Opal explained, and described certain landmarks in the landscape with a specificity that would satisfy any cartographer. The lightning-split oak at the head of Darkling Branch, the place where the creek makes a sound, like a woman humming, the rock shaped like a sleeping bear that marks the edge of the Laurel Hill on the north face of Clinch Mountain. And these landmarks served as a kind of map, a map not of trails and distances, but of relationships, a map that described how the human world and the mountain's deeper world fitted together, the way the pieces of a quilt fitted together, each piece distinct, each piece necessary, the pattern only visible when you stepped back far enough to see the whole. And the whole, Opal said, was not frightening but beautiful, a great design in which the lit places and the dark places each had their purpose, their dignity, each in their role in the turning of seasons and the passage of years, and the long, slow conversation between the people and the land that had been going on for so long that neither party could remember who had spoken first. On the third day of filming, Marin and her crew drove up a road that was not on any GPS, and that climbed through switchbacks so tight the van's mirrors nearly brushed the rhododendrons that pressed in from both sides, their leaves curled inward against the cold like small green scrolls containing messages written in a language only the winter understood. And at the top of this road, on a shoulder of the mountain where the wind came through, steady and cold and tasting of the ice that was forming on the highest peaks to the north, they found a clearing where a man named Jessamine Clay had built a cabin in 1978 from logs he had cut and notched and fitted together with the same dovetail joints his great-great-grandfather had used, a technique that required no nails and no glue, only the precise shaping of wood against wood, each joint so tight that a knife blade could not be slipped between them. And this precision, this devotion to the ancient craft, spoke of a relationship with materials that was not merely functional, but devotional, a recognition that the trees from which the logs had been taken were not resources, but relatives, that the forest had given something of itself, and the builder's only adequate response was to honor that gift with the most meticulous care his hands were capable of. Jessamine was 67 now, a lean and unhurried man whose beard was the color of wood ash and whose eyes had the particular clarity that comes from decades of looking at distances, at horizons, at the slow processional of weather across mountain ranges. And he made them coffee from beans he had roasted himself on a cast-iron skillet, the scent of it filling the cabin with a warmth that was almost visible. And he pointed through the window toward a fold in the mountains to the east, where the trees grew so densely that the canopy appeared almost black even in full daylight. And he said, "My grandfather called that place the Hush." And the word, the way he said it, carried a weight that went far beyond its two small syllables, as though the word itself partook of the quality it described, as though saying it too loudly or too carelessly might somehow disturb the very thing it named. And Marin noticed that he dropped his voice when he said it, not out of fear, but out of the same instinct that causes a person to whisper in a cathedral or beside a sleeping child, the instinct that recognizes sanctity not through doctrine, but through the body's own deep knowing. "The hush has been there longer than any of us," Jessamine said, holding his coffee in both hands and looking out at the dark fold in the ridgeline with an expression that was not wary but fond, the way one might regard a very old neighbor who keeps to themselves, but whose presence on the street is a source of comfort precisely because of its constancy, its permanence, its absolute refusal to change in a world that changes everything, Why, and it will be here after every one of us is gone. And that is not a sad thought, but a good one, a restful one, because it means that something endures, something keeps its own counsel, something in this world is old enough and patient enough and deep enough that it does not need our understanding or our permission or our light. And knowing that, truly knowing it in your body and not just in your mind, is the most peaceful thing I have ever learned. More peaceful than sleep, more peaceful than prayer. A peace that comes from understanding your place in a story so large that your own chapter, however beautiful, however full of love and labor, is no more than a single breath in a conversation that has been going on since the stone first cooled and the water first found its way downhill and the darkness first settled into the hollows and made them its home. The phenomenon of infrasound in geological formations was not new to science. Marin reflected as she sat in Jessamine's cabin that evening, after the crew had packed away the cameras and the light outside had thickened into the deep indigo that precedes full dark in the mountains, a color so saturated and so briefly held that it seemed less like a stage of twilight than like a gift, a momentary glimpse of the spectrum's hidden depths before the night closed over everything like a hand closing gently around a flame, not to extinguish it, but to shelter it, to keep its warmth close. And she thought about the studies she had read, the papers published in journals of geophysics and acoustics that described how certain rock formations, particularly the ancient metamorphic and sedimentary formations that composed the deep structure of the Appalachian Mountains, could generate standing waves of infrasound through the slow process of thermal contraction as the stone cooled after sunset, the molecules of quartz and feldspar and mica tightening infinitesimally in the falling temperature. And this tightening, this nightly contraction, produced vibrations that propagated through the rock at frequencies between 7 and 20 hertz, below the range of human hearing, but well within the range of human feeling. These vibrations, the studies suggested, could produce a remarkable array of physiological effects in the human body, including a sense of pressure on the skin, a deepening of the breath, a slowing of the heart rate, a feeling of awe or reverence that subjects consistently described as spiritual or numinous, and in certain topographies, particularly in narrow hollows with steep walls of exposed rock. These infrasonic waves could be focused and amplified the way sound is focused in a whispering gallery, creating zones where the vibration was strong enough to affect the inner ear and produce a sensation of disorientation that was not unpleasant, but profoundly unfamiliar. A feeling of being held inside a sound you could not hear, rocked by a rhythm you could not count. And Marin thought that this was perhaps what the people of these mountains had always known without needing to name it in the language of physics, that the earth itself was singing in a register, too deep for the ear, but not too deep for the body, and that certain places in these mountains were, for reasons of geology and topology, and the sheer accumulated weight of deep time, louder than others, more resonant, more attuned to the fundamental frequencies of stone and water, and the slow, patient turning of the planet on its axis. She shared this thought with Jessamine, who listened with the attentive stillness of a man who is not waiting to respond, but simply receiving. And when she had finished, he was quiet for a long time, and the fire crackled softly in the stove, and the darkness outside the windows was complete now, the kind of mountain darkness that is not the absence of light, but the presence of the night itself, substantial and enveloping. And at last he said, "Pe fade." That may be so, and I would not argue with it, but I would say that knowing the name of a thing and knowing the thing itself are two different kinds of knowing, and that the mountains do not care which kind you bring to them, only that you bring it quietly. And this seemed to Marin one of the truest things anyone had ever said to her, and she held it the way Opal Church had described holding the firefly, gently, in cupped hands, aware that some forms of knowledge are too delicate for the grip of certainty. On the fourth morning, which dawned clear and still and so cold that the grass in the clearing around Jessamine's cabin was white with frost that sparkled in the first light like a field of infinitesimal stars, but each blade of grass wearing its tiny crystal garment with an elegance that seemed to argue for the existence of a universe that cared deeply about beauty, even in its smallest and most temporary manifestations, Marin walked alone to the edge of the tree line and stood looking down into the hollow that Jessamine called the Hush. and she saw that the morning light, which was golden and clean and touched everything on the upper slopes with a clarity that made the colors of the autumn leaves seem almost painfully vivid, stopped at a certain line among the trees below, not abruptly but gradually, the way a shore stops the sea. And beyond that line the forest was dim, not shadowed exactly, but muted, as though seen through a pane of very old glass that had thickened unevenly over the centuries. And she stood there for a long time, she breathing the cold air that tasted of pine resin and frozen stone and the faintest trace of wood smoke from Jessamine's chimney. And she felt no desire to go closer, not because she was afraid, but because she recognized in herself the same instinct that Opal Church had described, the instinct that understands some thresholds without needing to cross them. A raven passed overhead, its wings making a sound like heavy silk being drawn across a table, and its shadow crossed the frost at her feet and was gone. And she thought about the way the people of these mountains had organized their entire existence around these zones of deep darkness, not in opposition to them, but in relationship with them. The way a river organizes itself around the boulders in its bed, not struggling against them but flowing around them, incorporating them, making them part of its pattern. And she understood that the homesteads built on the sunny sides of ridges were not retreats from the darkness, but acknowledgments of it, gestures of respect from one form of being to another, and that the quilts and the wood smoke and the kitchen tables where bread was broken and stories were murmured were not barriers against the unknown, but lanterns hung at its edge, small human lights held up not to illuminate the darkness, but to greet it, to say we are here, and we know you are there, and we are grateful for the boundary between us, because it is the boundary that gives each side its meaning. She returned to the cabin and found Jessamine making biscuits, his hands moving through the dough with the same unconscious precision he brought to everything. And the smell of the biscuits baking was so fundamental, so anchored in the sensory vocabulary of comfort and home, that she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. And she sat at his table and wrapped her hands around a mug of coffee and watched the steam rise and curl in the light from the window. And outside, the mountains held their vast and patient silence, and the darkness in the hollow below was neither closer nor farther than it had been the night before, neither larger nor smaller, simply there, as it had been there since before the first human footstep sounded on these slopes, as it would be there long after the last human footstep faded. And this knowledge, which might in another context have been melancholy, was here, in this kitchen, with the smell of biscuits and coffee and wood smoke, profoundly and unexpectedly peaceful, a peace that came not from understanding but from acceptance, from the willingness to live alongside mystery without demanding that it explain itself. The crew spent that afternoon interviewing a former park ranger named Lucille Prater, who had served for 28 years in the Daniel Boone National Forest, and who now lived in a small house surrounded by a garden, where she grew herbs whose names she had learned from her mother, who had learned them from her mother, who had learned them from a woman whose name was lost to time, but whose knowledge persisted in the garden like a melody that outlives the singer. Rosemary and sage and bee balm and something she called mountain mint that grew wild along the creeks, and that she dried in bundles hung from the ceiling of her porch, where they turned slowly in the air currents and filled the space with a scent that was at once sharp and soothing, a scent that seemed to contain within itself both the wildness of the mountains and the warmth of the kitchen, both the wind and the hearth. Lucille had a way of pausing before she spoke that was not hesitation, but consideration, a weighing of words that reflected a deep respect for language and for the listener. And when she talked about the zones, she called them the quiet places, which Maren thought was perhaps the most beautiful name she had heard for them. Her voice took on a quality that was neither hushed nor dramatic, but simply present, fully inhabiting each word the way the morning light had fully inhabited the frost on the grass. And she said that in her years as a ranger, she had learned to read the forest the way a sailor reads the sea, by subtle signs that most people would never notice, the angle at which the ferns grew, the particular shade of green in the moss, the behavior of the water striders on the surface of a creek. And she said that the quiet places announced themselves long before you reached them, in the gradual deepening of the silence, in the way the bird calls thinned and then stopped, in the almost imperceptible cooling of the air, Not a chill exactly, but a freshness, a cleanness, as though the air in those places had never been breathed, as though it had been held in reserve since the beginning of the world, waiting for no one. Arm belonging to nothing but itself, and the ancient stone from which it rose. We had protocols, Lucille said, and she smiled when she said it, a smile that was not amused but affectionate, the way one smiles at the memory of a well-intentioned misunderstanding. Official protocols that said our search area extended to the boundary of the national forest, and that we were to search systematically using grid patterns and GPS coordinates. And these protocols were designed by people who had never stood at the edge of a quiet place and felt the hair on their arms rise, not from cold and not from fear, but from something older than either, something the body knows that the mind has forgotten, the way the body knows how to breathe and how to heal a wound and how to grow a child from a single cell into a universe of bones and blood and dreams. And so what we did, those of us who had been there long enough to understand, was we followed the protocols up to the edge, and then we stopped, and we waited. And sometimes the lost person came out on their own, blinking and confused and unable to say how long they had been inside or what they had experienced, but unharmed, always unharmed, as though the darkness had held them the way a mother holds a child who has wandered too far, firmly but gently, keeping them safe until they found their way back to the path they recognized. She said this last part very softly, and the afternoon light was slanting through her kitchen window now, falling across the table in a wide golden band that illuminated the grain of the wood with extraordinary clarity, every ring and knot and ray visible, the every year of the tree's life legible in the pattern of its growth. And Marin thought that this was what the documentary was really about, not the darkness itself, but the light that existed in relationship to it, the way these communities had learned to live at the edge of the unknowable, and had found there not terror, but tenderness, not dread, but a deep and abiding peace that came from knowing their place in a pattern so vast and so ancient that the human mind could not encompass it. But the human heart, with its own ancient rhythms, its own deep knowing, could rest within it the way a stone rests at the bottom of a clear creek, held in place by the gentle, ceaseless pressure of water that has been flowing since before memory, since before language. Since before the first star burned and the first darkness gathered itself around the light and said, in its silent way, I will hold you. I will hold everything. I have been holding everything since the beginning, and I will hold everything until the end. And this holding is not a cage, but a cradle, not a prison, but a home. On the last evening of filming, the crew gathered on the porch of Opal Church's house, and the sky above the ridgeline was the color of a bruise healing, purple and amber and a blue so deep it seemed to hum, and the first stars appeared, not suddenly but gradually, as though they had always been there, and were simply becoming visible as the bright interference of the day faded. And Opal brought out a quilt that her grandmother had made in 1923 from scraps of fabric that had once been dresses and shirts and curtains, each piece carrying within its threads the ghost of a garment that had been worn against a body, warmed by a body, moved with a body through the daily acts of living, and the quilt was heavy and soft and smelled of cedar and lavender and the indefinable warmth of long storage in a dark chest, and she spread it across her lap and invited Marin to sit beside her, and the two women sat together in the gathering dark and said nothing for a long time, because the mountains were doing their evening work of settling, of releasing the day's heat into the sky, of gathering the darkness into their hollows like water into cupped hands, and this work required no commentary, only witness. At last, Opal said, Deshinauer. My grandmother told me that the dark places in the mountains are where the world goes to sleep, and her voice was so soft that it seemed to come from very far away, or from very long ago, as though the words had traveled not just from her mouth to Marin's ear, but from some much deeper source, some wellspring of knowing that lay beneath language and beneath thought in the place where the body and the earth share a common rhythm. And she said that when we sleep, we go to the same place, that sleep is the little dark, and the mountain dark is the big dark, and they are made of the same thing, the same stillness, the same rest, the same letting go of the light so that the light can come back new in the morning. And Marin felt the truth of this in her bones, in the heaviness of her eyelids. in the way her breathing had slowed without her choosing to slow it, as though her body were already responding to the invitation of the darkness, already beginning to make its nightly journey from the lit world to the unlit one, from the self that watches and speaks and records to the self that simply is, that simply rests, that simply breathes in the darkness like a stone at the bottom of a deep, clear, ancient pool. The stars were thick above them now, the Milky Way visible as a pale river of light running from horizon to horizon, and beneath it, the mountains were vast and black and still, and the darkness in the hollows was absolute, textured, alive with the faintest vibrations of geological time, the slow exhalation of mountains that were ancient before the Himalayas were born. And somewhere in that darkness, the infrasound was singing its deep and wordless song, 14 hertz, the frequency of rest, the frequency of the earth itself breathing. And the sound was not audible, but it was felt in the chest, in the bones, in the gentle loosening of thought that comes just before sleep, when the mind stops trying to hold the world together and lets it simply be, lets it rest in its own vast and patient order. And the two women sat together beneath the stars and the quilt and the enormous weight of the sky. And the darkness held them, and the mountains held the darkness, and the night held the mountains, and something older and larger than any of these held the night. And the holding was gentle, and the holding was complete, and the holding went on in every direction. Backward through time to the first darkness, and forward through time to the last star. And somewhere within this holding, small and warm and breathing, was every person who had ever lived in these mountains and loved them and listened to their silence and understood that the silence was not empty but full, not cold but warm, not lonely but companioned by a presence so vast and so patient that it made loneliness impossible. And in the houses along the creeks and the gravel roads, in the communities where the boundary stories were still told in the hour between supper and sleep, the wood stoves were banked for the night, and the quilts were pulled up, and the children were settling into the deep, untroubled sleep of those who have been taught from birth that the world is strange but safe, mysterious but kind. And outside their windows, the mountains breathed their slow geological breath, and the darkness pooled in the hollows like dark water, like dark honey, like the darkest and most restful thing in the universe, which is sleep, which is the letting go, which is the trust that the morning will come, because it has always come, because the earth turns and the light returns and the birds begin again their ancient work of singing the world awake. And until that moment, until the first pale thread of dawn appeared above the eastern ridge, the darkness held everything in its enormous and tender embrace. The trees and the stones and the sleeping houses and the creek still running their quiet courses through the night, carrying the mountain song downstream toward the sea that is itself a kind of darkness. A vast and patient body of unknowing that wraps the world in its arms and rocks it, gently, gently, the way a grandmother rocks a child, the way the night rocks the mountains, the way sleep rocks the sleeper into a place beyond words, beyond worry, beyond everything except the simple, profound, immeasurable peace of being held. The mountains had been there before the Himalayas, before the Andes, before the Atlantic Ocean had opened its slow blue eye between the continents, and they would be there after every name for them had been forgotten, after every story told about them had dissolved back into the silence from which all stories come. And this endurance was not a rebuke to the brevity of human life, but a comfort, a promise that something abides, something persists, something goes on holding and breathing and singing its deep infrasonic lullaby long after the individual voices have fallen silent. And the people who lived at the edges of the dark zones had always understood this, had always taken their rest from this understanding the way they took their water from the creeks and their warmth from the wood and their light from the fire, receiving it as a gift, holding it gently, letting it sustain them through the long nights and the short days and the cold that came down from the high peaks like a benediction, like a hand laid softly on a sleeping brow. Like the last words of a story told so quietly that the listener cannot tell where the telling ends and the dream begins. The mountain has a heart, and the heart has a door, and the door is always open, but it does not open for us. And this is not a sorrow but a mercy, not a mystery but a lullaby, Not a wall, but a quilt spread over the world, pieced from light and dark in equal measure, stitched with the thread of deep time, and beneath it everything rests, everything breathes, everything is held, and the holding is gentle, and the holding is old, and the holding does not end, and you are inside it now. You have always been inside it. And the darkness is not empty, and the silence is not cold. And the mountains are breathing, and the night is kind, and the sleep that is coming for you now is the same sleep that lives in the hollows, and the same sleep that lives in the stone, and the same sleep that has been waiting for you since before you were born. Patient and warm and deeper than any darkness, and it is here now, it is here, and you can rest, and you can rest, and you can rest. There is a particular quality of darkness that exists only in the deepest folds of these mountains. Darkness so complete and so unhurried that it does not feel like the absence of light so much as the presence of something else entirely, something textured and soft and faintly warm, the way the inside of the earth must feel to itself when no one is looking. And if you have ever pressed your palm flat against the exposed face of a cliff where the road crews have cut through a hillside, felt the cool dampness of shale that has not seen the sun since before your grandparents' grandparents were born, then you have touched the outermost edge of that darkness, have brushed your fingers against the hem of something so old that the word old barely begins to hold it. The Appalachian range does not tower the way younger mountains tower, does not thrust itself upward in jagged declarations of geological ambition, but instead lies low and long across the eastern spine of the continent, like something that finished speaking a very long time ago and has since settled into the profound, unhurried quiet of having said everything it needed to say. Its ridgelines soft as the curve of a sleeping shoulder beneath a heavy quilt. These mountains were once taller than the Himalayas, taller than anything currently standing on the surface of this planet, and the fact that they have worn themselves down to these gentle mist-wrapped shapes over the course of 480 million years is not a story of diminishment, but of patience, of a willingness to let time do its slow and tender work, the way a river does not break a stone, but simply loves it until the stone becomes something new, something smooth and rounded and perfectly quietly itself. And within these ancient folds, in the valleys that maps sometimes name but more often do not, there are places where search and rescue teams have learned, not through fear, but through a kind of deep, a bone-level respect, to pause at the tree line and go no further, not because anything waits inside those hollows with malice or hunger, but because the land there is so profoundly, so completely itself, that human intention seems to lose its footing the way a word loses its meaning when you repeat it long enough, dissolving back into pure sound, pure vibration, pure belonging. The documentary crews who have attempted to film in these areas describe the experience not as frightening but as disorienting in the gentlest possible way. The way you feel when you wake from a very deep nap in an unfamiliar room and cannot immediately remember which direction the door is, which wall holds the window, whether it is late afternoon or early morning, and for a few suspended cotton-soft seconds you do not mind not knowing. You simply rest inside the not knowing as though it were a warm bath drawn to exactly the right temperature. Their cameras capture what you might expect. Hemlock and rhododendrons so thick that the canopy closes overhead like the vaulted ceiling of a cathedral built by something with no concept of straight lines, moss covering every surface in a green so deep it borders on black, the occasional pale thread of water sliding over rock faces worn smooth by centuries of this same slow, devoted attention. But the footage, when reviewed later in editing suites hundreds of miles away, always seems to contain more shadow than the aperture settings should allow, as though the darkness itself were a substance that the forest produces, breathes out the way other forests breathe out oxygen, a gentle, generous exhalation of pure velvet dark. The sound recordists note something similar, a quality to the silence in these hollows that their equipment registers not as the absence of sound, but as an extremely low-frequency hum, barely perceptible, more felt than heard, vibrating at a pitch so deep it seems to rise from the bedrock itself, from the slow crystalline pulse of quartz veins running through granite that remembers being the floor of an ancient sea. And the sound, if you can call it a sound, has the curious effect of making the listener's breathing slow and deepen without their noticing, as though the body recognizes something in that frequency that the conscious mind has long since forgotten how to name. These are the recordings that researchers at the university sleep laboratories have studied with a kind of quiet fascination, noting that subjects who listen to them through headphones in darkened rooms report not anxiety but an unusual, almost narcotic sense of peace, a heaviness in the limbs that feels less like fatigue and more like permission, as though the body has been waiting a very long time for someone or something to tell it that it is allowed to stop, to rest, to let the weight of wakefulness slide from its shoulders like a coat removed at the end of a long, cold walk. And the mountains, in their ancient and absolute indifference, provide exactly that permission, simply by being what they are, which is to say, still. The first formal documentation of these zones, these pockets of deep, a particular strangeness woven into the ordinary fabric of the Appalachian wilderness, appears not in any government report or scientific paper, but in the handwritten journal of a surveyor named Elias Boone, who in the autumn of 1847 was tasked with mapping a series of hollows in what is now the border country between West Virginia and Virginia, hollows that the local families referred to simply as the quiet places, the way you might refer to a room in your house where you go to be alone, not because the room is strange, but because it holds a quality of stillness that the rest of the house does not. A stillness you have come to rely on the way you rely on the particular weight of your favorite blanket or the sound of rain against a window you have slept beneath for years. Boone's journal entries, preserved now under glass in a small county historical society that smells of cedar and aging paper, describe his experience with a measured calmness that borders on wonder, noting that upon entering the first of these hollows, a narrow defile between two ridges so thickly forested that the canopy blocked all but a few scattered coins of pale, watery light, his compass needle began to drift in slow, lazy circles, not spinning wildly as compasses do in stories meant to frighten, but rotating with a dreamy, unhurried deliberation, as though the instrument had simply lost interest in the concept of north and had decided instead to point toward something older, something deeper. Something that existed before the magnetic poles had settled into their current arrangement, and the continents had drifted to their present positions like sleeping children shifting under shared covers. He wrote that the air in the hollow was noticeably warmer than the air on the ridge above, and that it carried a mineral smell he compared to the scent of a stone church after rain, that particular fragrance of wet limestone and centuries of accumulated quiet, and that the moss beneath his boots was so thick and so soft that walking felt less like walking and more like wading through something that wanted, very gently, to hold him in place, not to trap him, but to slow him, to suggest through the patient, yielding resistance of its own body, that perhaps there was no need to move so quickly, no need to measure and map and name, or that perhaps the hollow already knew its own dimensions and was content with them, the way the sea knows its own depth without needing anyone to drop a weighted line. And what strikes the reader most about Boone's account, reading it now under the soft amber light of the Historical Society's single standing lamp, is not any sense of danger or dread, but the way his handwriting changes as the entries progress, the letters growing larger and rounder and more widely spaced, as though his hand were slowing to match the rhythm of the place he was describing, as though the quiet of the hollow had seeped into his very penmanship, and by the final entry, dated 3 days after he first descended into the defile, his words have taken on a quality that can only be described as drowsy, a gentle loosening of syntax and purpose, the sentences trailing off not in confusion but in a kind of contentment, the way a sentence trails off when the person speaking it has realized, mid-thought, that the listener has already fallen asleep, and that the words themselves have become unnecessary, have become simply sound, simply breath, simply the soft rhythmic proof that someone is nearby, and that everything, for now, is held. The search and rescue teams who work these mountains, men and women whose competence is quiet, and whose knowledge of the terrain is carried not in manuals, but in the body. In the specific way the knees bend on a 40-degree slope, and the particular angle at which a headlamp should be tilted to read the ground fog that pours through these hollows like something poured from a very slow, very ancient pitcher. Speak about the dark zones with a respect that is notably free of superstition, the way a carpenter speaks about a piece of old-growth timber that refuses to take a nail, not with frustration, but with a recognition that the wood has its own intentions, its own grain, its own memory of the tree it once was, and that the carpenter's job is not to overpower that memory, but to work alongside it, to find the places where the wood is willing to accept the blade and to leave the rest alone. They will tell you, if you sit with them long enough on one of those porches that seem to exist outside of time, the kind of porch where the boards have been worn smooth by generations of feet, and the rocking chairs move even when no one is sitting in them, stirred by whatever faint current of air finds its way up from the valley floor. That the decision not to enter certain areas is not a policy written down anywhere, not a rule handed from one administration to the next, but a knowledge passed from one body to another, the way a parent teaches a child to swim, not through instruction, but through presence, through the shared experience of water, through the moment when the child feels the water hold them and understands, without words, that they are supported. One team leader, a woman named Harlan, though whether this is her first name or her last name, or simply the name the mountain gave her is something she has never clarified and no one has ever asked, describes the boundary of a dark zone not as a line on a map but as a feeling in the sternum, a gentle pressure, a warmth, the way you feel when you are standing at the threshold of a room where someone you love very much is sleeping, and you do not want to wake them, and so you stand there for a moment, breathing quietly, watching the slow rise and fall of the blanket over their chest, and you understand that the most loving thing you can do in that moment is to leave the door exactly as it is, neither open nor closed, but resting in between, and to carry the image of their peace with you as you turn away. She says the mountains are sleeping, and she says this not as metaphor, but as description, the way you might describe the color of a stone or the temperature of a creek. And when she says it, sitting in the blue hour just after sunset, when the ridgelines have dissolved into the sky and the first few fireflies have begun their slow phosphorescent negotiations with the dark, her voice carries the same low, unhurried frequency that the sound recordists captured in their equipment, and you realize that she is not telling you about the mountains so much as letting the mountains speak through her, the way a tuning fork does not create a sound, but simply makes audible a vibration that was always already there, waiting in the metal, waiting in the air, waiting in the space between. There are geological explanations, of course, offered in the measured, unhurried cadence of scientists who have spent enough time in these mountains to know that explanation and understanding are not always the same thing. The way a map is not the territory and a name is not the thing it names, and these explanations are beautiful in their own right, beautiful the way all true accounts of deep time are beautiful, because they ask us to hold in our minds a span of years so vast that the mind itself becomes a kind of landscape, stretching and folding and wearing down under the weight of so much accumulated patience. The bedrock beneath these particular hollows, they will tell you, belongs to some of the oldest exposed rock on the continent, in Precambrian gneiss and schist that formed more than 1 billion years ago when this part of the Earth's crust was being compressed and heated and folded over itself like dough being worked by hands so large and so slow that a single kneading motion took 50 million years to complete. And this rock carries within its crystalline structure a record of pressures and temperatures that no longer exist anywhere on the surface of the planet, conditions so extreme and so ancient that the minerals themselves, the feldspars and the micas, and the thin, glittering veins of quartz that catch the light of a headlamp and throw it back in colors that seem to come from somewhere deeper than the visible spectrum, have arranged themselves into patterns that modern instruments can detect but not entirely explain. There is a particular formation found only in the deepest of these hollows, a type of magnetite-rich schist that generates its own faint electromagnetic field, measurable with sensitive equipment as a low, steady pulse that rises and falls on cycles so long, decades, perhaps centuries, that no single human lifetime has been sufficient to observe a complete oscillation. And this field, this slow planetary heartbeat buried in the rock, may account for the compass drift that Boone recorded in his journal and that every surveyor since has confirmed, the needle not spinning but drifting, describing lazy, contemplative circles as though the instrument were dreaming, as though the concept of direction itself had softened and dissolved in the presence of something that existed before direction had any meaning. Before north was north and south was south, and the magnetic poles had chosen their positions, back when the molten iron at the core of the planet was still deciding which way to flow, still turning over in its sleep, still settling into the pattern it would hold for the next several 100 million years before shifting again. Because even the planet's deepest certainties are temporary, are provisional, are simply the current arrangement of forces that will, given enough time, rearrange themselves into something new, something equally beautiful, something equally still. The fog that rises from these hollows is unlike fog anywhere else in the Appalachians, which is saying something, because the Appalachians are a place where fog is not weather so much as it is a feature of the landscape. As permanent and as defining as the trees or the stone or the particular quality of light that filters through the canopy in late October, when the leaves have thinned enough to let the sun reach the forest floor. In long, slanted beams that seem to carry weight, seem to press gently against the moss and the fallen leaves and the surface of the creeks with a warmth that feels almost like touch, almost like the hand of someone who has been gone for a long time, resting briefly, tenderly on the top of your head before moving on. The fog in the dark zones rises not from bodies of water. There are no lakes in these hollows, and the creeks are too small and too deeply shaded to produce the kind of evaporation that feeds ordinary fog. But from the ground itself, from the breathing of the stone, from the slow release of moisture that has been traveling through limestone chambers and sandstone capillaries for decades or centuries, water that fell as rain during the Eisenhower administration, or the Roosevelt administration, or the administration of presidents whose names have been softened by time into syllables that sound more like the names of trees than the names of men. And this water, having spent so long in the dark, having been filtered through so many layers of mineral and memory, rises into the air with a temperature and a density that is subtly, perceptibly different from the fog on the ridges above, warmer by exactly the number of degrees that the body registers, not as warmth, but as comfort, as the specific temperature at which the muscles along the back of the neck begin to release their habitual tension. The temperature of a bath drawn by someone who knows you well enough to know exactly how hot you like the water, and the fog carries with it that mineral scent, that stone church after rain fragrance that Boone described, and something else too, something the old families in these hollows call the sweetness. Though it is not precisely sweet, is not sugar or honey or fruit, but something closer to the smell of very old wood, heartwood, the interior of a tree that has been standing for 300 years and has developed within its core a fragrance that is less a scent and more a statement of presence, a way of saying, I am here, I have been here, I will be here long after the question of here and not here has ceased to matter. And this is the smell that fills the hollows at dawn. That drifts up through the canopy and dissipates on the ridgelines. That search and rescue teams sometimes catch on their clothing hours after they have left the boundary of a dark zone, a faint, clinging sweetness that fades so slowly it is less like a smell disappearing and more like a memory settling into its permanent place in the body, becoming part of the texture of experience, part of the way the world feels from now on, subtly and irreversibly changed. The stories that the families tell, the families who have lived in these mountains for so many generations, that the distinction between family history and geological history has worn thin, has become as porous and permeable as the limestone through which the ancient water travels, are not stories of fear or warning, but stories of etiquette, of the proper way to behave in the presence of something much older and much larger than yourself, the way you learn to behave in a library or a cathedral, or at the bedside of someone who is resting deeply, someone whose sleep is so important and so necessary that the world has arranged itself around the protection of that sleep, has drawn the curtains and dimmed the lights and asked everyone to please, if they would, lower their voices and soften their steps. Not because the sleeper is fragile, but because sleep itself is sacred, is the means by which the body repairs and remembers and releases, and to interrupt it would be not dangerous, but unkind, a small cruelty in a world that has no need of cruelties, small or otherwise. An elderly man named Tolliver, who lives in a cabin at the head of a hollow that appears on some maps and not on others, whose porch overlooks a meadow where the grass grows in a particular shade of green that seems to produce its own light in the hour before sunset, once explained to a visiting researcher, speaking slowly, with long pauses between sentences, during which the only sounds were the creaking of his rocking chair and the distant, odd liquid commentary of a wood thrush delivering its evening sermon from the top of a tulip poplar. That his grandmother had taught him to think of the dark zones the way you think of the deep parts of a river, the pools beneath the ledges where the water is so cold and so still and so clear that you can see all the way to the bottom, can see the individual stones resting there in their patient arrangement, and you would no more wade into that pool than you would walk into a room where the furniture has been placed just so by someone who has spent a very long time getting it right, because to disturb the arrangement would be to lose something that cannot be replaced, not a thing, but a quality, a particular relationship between objects and space and time that took centuries to achieve and that exists in a state of such perfect, such exquisite balance that even the light seems to know its place, falling at exactly the right angle, at exactly the right intensity, illuminating exactly what needs to be illuminated, and leaving the rest in a shadow that is not absence, but protection, not darkness, but privacy. The deep, necessary privacy of stone that is still in the process of becoming what it will be, still folding, still settling, still dreaming its slow mineral dreams in a language that predates language, that predates sound, that predates the very concept of communication, and rests instead in the pure, undifferentiated hum of matter being itself, fully and completely and without apology. And Tolliver, having said all of this or something very close to it, fell silent and rocked and watched the light drain from the meadow like water finding its level. Oh, and the researcher, sitting beside him in a borrowed chair, found that her notebook had closed itself in her lap, and that her pen had come to rest against her thigh, and that her eyes were half closed, and that her breathing had matched itself, without her permission or her awareness, to the slow, steady rhythm of the old man's rocking, which was itself matched to something deeper, something below the porch and below the meadow and below the bedrock, some fundamental pulse that she could feel in the soles of her feet and in the base of her spine and in the soft, warm hollow at the center of her chest where the breath begins its journey, and to which the breath always, always returns. The limestone chambers beneath these hollows, and it is worth pausing here, worth letting the mind descend through the layers of soil and clay and fractured rock the way water descends, slowly, finding the path of least resistance, following the tiny channels and fissures that open in stone, the way sleep opens in the mind, not all at once, but gradually. One small surrender leading to the next, are among the least explored cave systems in the eastern United States, not because they are inaccessible, but because the few spelunkers who have entered them report an experience so profoundly, so overwhelmingly peaceful, that the impulse to explore further simply dissolves, the way an ambition dissolves when you realize that what you were seeking is already present, has been present all along, was in fact the very ground you were standing on while you were looking everywhere else. The chambers are small by the standards of more famous cave systems, rooms no larger than a modest bedroom, connected by passages that narrow and widen and narrow again, like the breathing of something asleep, and the walls of these chambers are covered, every inch, every surface, with a thin, luminous film of calcite that has been deposited over millennia by the patient, mineral-laden water that seeps through the limestone above, and this calcite, in the beam of a headlamp, produces a glow that is not reflection, but something closer to absorption and release, as though the stone were taking in the light, holding it for a moment the way you hold a breath, and then letting it go in a slightly altered form, softer, warmer, tinged with the faintest possible amber. The color of very old honey, or the light that comes through the windows of a room where beeswax candles have been burning for a long, long time. The temperature in these chambers holds steady at precisely 57 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of what the seasons are doing on the surface above. 57 degrees in the hammering heat of August, and 57 degrees in the deep iron cold of January. And this constancy, this absolute indifference to the passage of seasons and the turning of the planet toward and away from the sun, is perhaps the most accurate expression of what these mountains are, what they have always been, not hostile, not welcoming, but simply present, simply here, occupying their place in the spectrum of existence with a completeness that leaves no room for opinion or intention. The way a stone occupies its place on a riverbed, the way a star occupies its place in the slow wheel of the galaxy, the way sleep occupies its place in the architecture of a life, not as interruption, but as foundation, not as absence, but as the deepest and most necessary form of presence, the state from which all waking rises and to which all waking returns, the ground beneath the ground beneath the ground. There is a creek that runs along the southern boundary of one of the largest documented dark zones, a creek so small and so quiet that it does not appear on any topographic map and has no official name, though the families who live downstream from it, families whose surnames have been carved into these hollows for so long that the carvings themselves have weathered and softened and become part of the landscape, or indistinguishable from the natural grooves and channels that rain cuts into sandstone, call it the whispering, not because the water makes a sound that resembles whispering, but because the sound the water makes is so close to silence that the ear has to lean into it, has to reach toward it, the way you lean toward someone who is speaking very softly in a room where everyone else has fallen asleep. And in that leaning, in that reaching, the ear opens itself in a way that it does not normally open, becomes sensitive to frequencies and textures of sound that are always present, but usually buried beneath the louder, more insistent noises of the waking world. The way stars are always present in the daytime sky, but are buried beneath the louder, more insistent light of the sun. And this opening, this sensitization, is its own kind of gift. A recalibration of attention that leaves the listener feeling not depleted but restored, as though the act of listening deeply were itself a form of rest, a way of laying down the burden of constant interpretation and simply letting sound be sound, letting the creek be the creek, letting the water do what water has always done, which is to move without agenda and to carry within its current the dissolved memories of everything it has touched, the copper and the calcium and the iron and the silica, the shed leaves and the fallen pollen and the microscopic fragments of stone that were part of a mountain, that was part of a continent, that was part of a world that looked nothing like this world. That existed before the Atlantic Ocean had opened and before the dinosaurs had arrived and departed and before the ice had come down from the north and retreated and come down again, patient as breath, patient as the tide, patient as the slow planetary rhythm that governs the expansion and contraction of ice sheets across cycles of 100,000 years, cycles so long and so steady that they resemble nothing so much as the breathing of the earth itself, the rise and fall of a chest so vast that a single inhalation takes 50,000 years and a single exhalation takes 50,000 more. And we are here now, in the middle of an exhalation, in the slow, warm release that follows the last ice age, the world breathing out, the glaciers retreating, the forests returning. The mountains emerging from beneath their white blankets, like sleepers emerging from beneath their covers in the soft, unhurried light of a morning that has no appointments to keep, no alarms to answer, no reason to begin except the simple, sufficient reason that the light has come, and the air is warm, and the birds have started singing, and the day, such as it is here. The search and rescue protocols, such as they are, unwritten, carried in the body, passed from one generation of mountain workers to the next, through shared experience rather than formal training, include a practice that the teams call listening, though it bears little resemblance to listening as the word is commonly understood, is not the directed, purposeful attention of someone trying to hear a specific sound, but rather a full-body receptivity, a softening of all the senses simultaneously, a letting go of the habitual vigilance that keeps the mind scanning for threats and the muscles braced against surprise, and in its place, a kind of cellular openness, the way a plant opens to rain, not reaching for it, but simply allowing itself to be reached, to be touched, was to be entered by something it needs and has been waiting for without knowing it was waiting. When a team reaches the edge of a dark zone, the place where the compass begins its slow, contemplative drift, and the air takes on that particular warmth, and the mineral sweetness rises from the ground like an offering, the team leader will stop, and the team will stop, and they will stand there together in the green, dark quiet, breathing, not speaking, not moving, simply being present at the threshold, the way you are present at a window late at night when you cannot sleep, and you stand looking out at the yard and the street and the distant glow of a town you have lived in your whole life, but which looks, in this particular light, at this particular hour, like a place you have never seen before, a place that exists only in this moment. Only in this quality of attention, only in the space between wakefulness and sleep where the world becomes porous and the boundaries between inside and outside, between self and landscape, between the one who listens and the thing being listened to, dissolve into a single, continuous field of quiet awareness. And this is what the search and rescue teams are doing at the boundary of the dark zones, not making a decision, but allowing a decision to be made for them. By the land, by the stone, by the slow electromagnetic pulse of the magnetite schist that vibrates at a frequency so low that it is less a sound and more a permission. And the teams will tell you that the answer is almost always the same. Stay here. Do not go further, not because what lies beyond is dangerous, but because what lies beyond is resting, is complete, is in a state of such perfect, such absolute equilibrium that even the addition of a single human heartbeat would be a kind of interruption, a ripple in a pond that has finally, after millennia of rippling, achieved stillness. And to introduce a ripple into that stillness, even a well-intentioned ripple, even a ripple motivated by care and urgency and the very human need to find and rescue and save, would be to undo something that cannot be undone, would be to wake something that has earned its sleep through 400 million years of patient, devoted, uninterrupted dreaming. The geologists who study these formations, and they are a particular breed of scientist, the ones drawn to the Appalachians, quieter than their colleagues who chase volcanoes and fault lines, more inclined to sit than to stand, not more inclined to listen than to speak, scientists who have learned that the most important data is often the data you collect by simply being present in a place for a very long time, the way lichen collects data about the stone. It grows on, not through analysis, but through intimacy, through the slow, devoted act of living against a surface for decades and centuries until the distinction between the lichen and the stone becomes a matter of perspective rather than fact. These geologists will tell you that the Appalachians are not a single mountain range, but a palimpsest, a text written over itself so many times that the original message has become inseparable from the revisions, each layer of rock recording a different era, a different world, a different arrangement of continents and oceans and atmospheres. And to read this text, you must be willing to hold multiple timescales simultaneously, must be willing to let your sense of the present moment expand backward and forward until it encompasses not just this breath and this heartbeat and this particular configuration of stars in the sky above the ridgeline, but also the breath and heartbeat of the planet itself, the long, slow systole and diastole of mountain building and erosion, the rise and fall of seas across what is now dry land, the coming and going of ice, the patient accumulation of sediment on ocean floors that will, given enough time and enough pressure, become the sandstone and the limestone and the shale that you can reach out and touch right now on any road cut in West Virginia or North Carolina. Touching with your bare hand the compressed remains of creatures that lived and died in warm, shallow seas 400 million years ago. Trilobites and brachiopods and crinoids whose bodies were gently, imperceptibly converted into stone, their calcium traded molecule by molecule for silica. Their forms preserved with such fidelity that you can see the individual segments of a trilobite's exoskeleton, can trace with your fingertip the ridges and the furrows of a body that has been sleeping in the rock since before the first tree grew on land, before the first amphibian crawled from the water onto the mud of a shoreline that no longer exists on any continent. And there is something in this touching, in this laying of one's warm, living hand against the cool, ancient surface of a fossil. That partakes of the same quality the search and rescue teams describe at the boundary of the dark zones, a quality of meeting, of two temporalities brushing against each other like the edges of two curtains stirred by the same faint breeze. And in that meeting, in that brief silent contact between the quick and the still, something is exchanged, something without a name, something that settles into the body the way sediment settles into the bed of a very slow river, and becomes, over time, part of the structure, part of the foundation, part of the bedrock upon which everything else is built. The night sounds of these mountains arrange themselves into layers, the way the rock arranges itself into layers, each stratum of sound corresponding to a different depth of darkness, a different distance from the human world. And if you were to lie on your back on a sleeping pad at the edge of one of these hollows, which is as far as the search and rescue teams go, and which is, in its own way, the perfect distance, close enough to feel the warmth and smell the sweetness, and hear the whispering creek doing its patient, ceaseless work, but far enough that the dark zone's profound equilibrium remains undisturbed, you would hear first the sounds you expect, the sounds that belong to the uppermost layer of the night, the layer closest to the human world, the layer that is still, in some sense, yours. The chirping of crickets, which is not one sound, but thousands of sounds, woven so tightly together that they become a single shimmering fabric, a blanket of sound pulled over the landscape the way an actual blanket is pulled over a body that is ready for sleep. And beneath the crickets, the occasional low, resonant call of a barred owl. Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all? The owl's voice carrying through the trees with a quality that is less sound and more touch. A soft, feathered hand laid against the night's cool cheek, and beneath the owl, the sound of the breeze in the canopy, which is not wind so much as it is the trees breathing, each leaf a tiny green lung exhaling the day's accumulated warmth into the cooling air. And this breathing, this collective exhalation of 10,000 leaves, creates a sound that is not quite a rustle and not quite a sigh, but something in between, something that the body recognizes before the mind does, something that the body has been listening to since before it was a body, since it was a smaller, simpler thing curled in the warm dark of another body, listening to the sound of breathing that was not its own. And this recognition, this deep pre-verbal familiarity, is what allows the muscles to begin their slow release, the jaw unclenching, the shoulders dropping, the fingers uncurling from whatever invisible thing they have been gripping all day. And beneath this layer of sound, there is another layer, quieter, deeper, belonging not to the creatures of the surface, but to the mountain itself, the faint, almost subliminal creaking of bedrock adjusting to the cooling night, the thermal contraction of stone that has been warmed all day by the sun and is now releasing that warmth back into the earth. And this sound, this slow, geological groaning, is what the old families mean when they say the mountain is settling, is getting comfortable, is pulling the covers up under its chin. And beneath even this there is the lowest layer of all, the layer that is not quite sound and not quite silence, but the place where sound and silence meet and recognize each other as the same thing, the hum of the magnetite, the pulse of the quartz, the deep steady vibration of a planet turning on its axis at 1,000 miles an hour. But feeling, from here, from this sleeping pad at the edge of this hollow in these ancient, ancient mountains, as still and as steady and as safe as the floor of a room where you have slept every night of your life, a room whose every shadow is familiar, whose every creak is known, whose darkness is not the absence of light, but the presence of rest, the presence of permission, the presence of the deep cellular knowledge that you are held, you are supported. You are cradled in the palm of something so large and so old and so patient that your weight upon it is not a burden but a comfort, the way the weight of a sleeping child is a comfort to the arms that hold it, and the arms do not tire, and the child does not fall, and the night goes on, steady and dark and sweet, and the mountains breathe, and the water moves, and the stone remembers, and the stars turn overhead in their ancient unhurried wheel. And you are here, and you are safe, and you are exactly where you are supposed to be. The mist that gathers in the deepest part of the hollow before dawn, and dawn comes late to these places, later than anywhere else, because the ridgelines on either side rise so steeply and are crowned so thickly with hemlock and spruce that the sun must climb a considerable distance above the eastern horizon before its light can find its way down into the narrow slot of sky above the creek. And this delay, this extra hour or so of darkness that the hollow retains while the ridges above are already gilded and warming, is itself a kind of gift, an extension of the night that feels less like the morning being withheld and more like the darkness being generous, offering you a little more of itself before it goes, the way a host offers you one more cup of tea before you leave. Not because the tea is necessary, but because the sitting together is, because the warmth of the cup in your hands and the steam rising into the space between your faces is a form of language more honest than any words, a way of saying, I am glad you are here, stay a little longer, there is no rush. This mist is so thick and so warm and so faintly luminous that to stand in it is to stand inside a cloud that has decided not to float, has decided instead to rest here in this hollow, the way a cat decides to rest in a patch of sunlight, not because the patch of sunlight is the best place or the only place, but because it is here and it is warm and the cat's body fits inside it perfectly, and there is no reason at all to move. The mist carries the mineral sweetness more intensely than at any other time of day, a concentration of scent that fills not just the nostrils but the entire chest, as though the lungs themselves were being lined with a thin protective layer of something ancient and clean, and people who have breathed this air, the handful of researchers who have been granted permission by the families to camp at the edge of the dark zones, the search and rescue teams who have spent nights here during extended operations, the occasional hiker who wandered in before the trails were rerouted and who sat down on a fallen log to rest and woke 4 hours later feeling more restored than any night of sleep in a bed had ever made them feel. These people described the experience with a consistency that the researchers find remarkable, using the same words independently of each other across decades and across counties. Words like held and heavy and home, and the word that appears most frequently, the word that seems to rise from the experience the way the mist rises from the stone, is the word safe, spoken not as an observation about the absence of danger, but as a description of a positive quality, a felt presence, the way warmth is a felt presence, the way the weight of a good blanket on a cold night is not the absence of cold, but the presence of something else, something that wraps around the body and says, through the language of pressure and temperature, and the gentle, even distribution of its own substance across the full length and breadth of the sleeping form beneath it, you are enclosed, you are covered, you are held within something that will not let go, that does not know how to let go. That has been holding the world in exactly this way since before the word world existed, since before words existed, since before the concept of holding existed, and the holding was simply what was, the way gravity is simply what is, not a force exerted, but a relationship maintained, the patient, ceaseless, utterly reliable attraction between one piece of matter and another, between the body and the earth, between the breath and the air, between the sleeper and the sleep. Harlan, the team leader, the woman whose name might be a place or a person, or simply a sound that the mountains make when the wind is from the south, speaks sometimes in the late hours when the fire has burned down to its final orange coals and the darkness has closed in around the porch like water closing around a stone dropped into a very deep, very quiet pool. About a concept she calls the long rest, which is her term for the state that the dark zones exist in, the state that is not sleep and not waking, but something older than either, something that preceded the evolution of consciousness and that will persist long after consciousness has done whatever it came here to do and moved on, the way weather moves on, the way seasons move on, the way the light moves on from one part of the sky to the next without ever stopping, without ever pausing, but also without ever hurrying, because the light has nowhere to be that it is not already. And the dark zones, she says, in her low, unhurried voice that sounds less like speech and more like the creek sounds, like water finding its way over smooth, ancient stone. The dark zones are places where the earth has not forgotten this. has not been distracted from this fundamental fact by the noise and motion of biological life on its surface, has not lost track of its own deep rhythm the way we lose track of ours. And when you stand at the edge of one of these places, when you feel that warmth in your sternum and that gentle pressure and that sweetness in the air, what you are feeling is not something alien or supernatural or even particularly unusual. You are feeling the original tempo, the bass line, the rhythm that was playing before the first note was added, and your body recognizes it? She says, your body has always recognized it, because your body is made of the same materials that the mountains are made of, the same iron and calcium and silica, the same elements forged in the cores of stars that exploded before our sun was born. And these elements remember. She says, they remember the furnace, and they remember the cooling, and they remember the long, slow drift through space, and they remember the gathering, and the compressing, and the heating, and the folding, and they remember the rest that followed, the deep geological rest that the mountains have been engaged in for hundreds of millions of years. And when your body comes close to a place where that rest is still undisturbed, still ongoing, still humming along at its original frequency, something in your iron and your calcium and your silica says, oh yes, I know this place. I have been away for a very long time, but I know this place. And the knowing is what feels like coming home, and the coming home is what feels like safety. And the safety is what allows the eyes to close, and the breath to deepen, and the mind to release its grip on the 10,000 things it has been carrying all day, all week, all year, all life, and to set them down gently at the edge of the hollow, the way you set down a heavy pack at the end of a long trail, and to stand there, empty-handed and light, feeling the cool air on the place where the straps pressed into your shoulders, feeling the blood return, feeling the body remember what it feels like to carry nothing, to need nothing, to be nothing but itself, standing at the edge of something vast and old and perfectly still. And so the mountains hold their silence, and the dark zones keep their counsel, and the mist rises and falls with the breathing of the stone. Vune and the water moves through its ancient channels in the dark, carrying its dissolved cargo of memory and mineral toward some destination that is not a place, but a process, not an arrival, but a continuous, unhurried becoming. And the search and rescue teams respect the boundary, not because they are afraid, but because they understand, in the wordless way that the body understands gravity and warmth and the specific pressure of a hand resting on the back of the neck in the moment before sleep, that some things are not meant to be entered, but only to be known, not meant to be mapped, but only to be felt, not meant to be explained, but only to be rested beside, the way you rest beside a river without needing to know where the river begins or where the river ends, trusting only that the sound it makes is good, and that the air above it is cool, and that the light on its surface is the same light that has been falling on water since the first water gathered in the first low place on the surface of the cooling earth, and that this is enough, this has always been enough, this will always be enough. And if you are listening to this now, lying in your own particular darkness, in your own particular hollow, between the ridgelines of your day and the ridgelines of your tomorrow, then you are already at the boundary, already standing at the place where the compass drifts and the air warms and the sweetness rises, and the body says, oh yes, I know this. And the knowing is not a thought, but a release, not an understanding, but a softening, not a discovery, but a return. And the mountains are breathing. And you are breathing, and the rhythm is the same, has always been the same, will always be the same. And you can set your pack down now. You can set everything down, the worry and the planning and the remembering and the reaching. You can set it all at the edge of the hollow and stand there empty-handed in the sweet, warm dark. And the dark will hold you the way it holds everything, the way it holds the stone and the water and the roots of the hemlocks and the slow, patient fossils of creatures who swam in ancient seas and who rest now in the bedrock like sleepers in their beds, like dreamers in their dreams. Like you in this moment, held and heavy and home, the word home being not a place you go to but a place you already are, have always been, will always be. The ground beneath you steady, the dark around you soft. the mountains old and quiet and near, and the night going on and on, going on and on, steady and sweet and safe, the slow turning of the earth carrying you through the dark the way a river carries a leaf, gently, without effort, without destination, simply carrying, simply moving, simply being the thing that it is, which is enough, which has always been enough, which will always, always, always be enough.